I dove Titanic in 2005. I actually had lunch on board. It was a 12-hour dive, and we landed on the bridge where Captain Smith was last seen, and had our box lunches and teed up Beatles' Yellow Submarine on our little tape recorder. So I've experienced that dive, and I know what they were hoping to see, and I hope they did see it. But we don't have a lot of information.
When you heard about this story, what was the information that you kind of wanted to glean first of all, so you could get a sense of how bad this is?
Well, just I think the facts that we all have now, that they lost contact with the a sub about an hour and a half after they started the dive. My understanding from the uh, materials on the website for OceanGate is that the dives are about 8 hours long. So I'm just guessing that they're allowing maybe 1 to 2 hours to get down to the seafloor, to the wreck, and then a certain amount of time on the wreck, and then you come back up pretty fast, maybe an hour or so to get back to the surface. So an hour and a half after they left the surface, they had to have been pretty close to the wreck of a couple thousand feet. I'm sorry, I'm not metric over here. But I think they're probably within a couple thousand feet above the Titanic before they would have landed there. And then they went silent. Well, there's a lot of reasons for being silent. They may have lost battery power. A piece of electronics may not work anymore, and their underwater telephone is not functioning. But um, they, if they came back up to the surface because they had an emergency on board, they have this massive drop weight that they carry down, because simple. If you want to dive, you get heavy, go down. If you want to get light and come back up, you get rid of weight. So they have these drop weights. And if they dropped that and came back up to the surface, it might be a little hard to find that that sub on the surface. As Hamish, and I can use his first name because I had lunch with him in January in New York. As he said, the weather wasn't great. And of course, as an aviator, he's a good gauge of weather. And if it's not great, that means this little object, this sub, not terribly big, it's going to be hard to find on the surface of the ocean. And the fellows that are professionals in search and rescue, the Coast Guard, Canadian Coast Guard, and our US Coast Guard, know how difficult it is to see basically a little boat in a great big ocean where the waves are kind of angry. So
Presumably, Dawn, the people in charge of this kind of mission, whatever you want to call it, they prepare for every eventuality. So, what would the preparation be for all the different scenarios, and indeed, I suppose the worst case scenario here?
well, you keep going through the what if business. I was the designated the first submersible pilot in the Navy, so I've been at it for 60 years, I guess. And you're always doing the what ifs. This happens, then what do you do now, and so on. So it's a pretty elaborate and well choreographed pre-dive checklists. And during the dive, you're constantly alert. You're on your game as the pilot, and then coming back up, the same thing. You have to be very careful. Things can go wrong in a hurry. Maybe they did in this case. I don't know. I dove Titanic in 2005. I actually had lunch on board. It was a 12-hour dive, and we landed on the bridge where Captain Smith was last seen, and had our box lunches and teed up Beatles' Yellow Submarine on our little tape recorder. So I've experienced that dive, and I know what they were hoping to see, and I hope they did see it. But we don't have a lot of information.
Yeah. Um, I, I, I said at the beginning, Dawn, that you've been to the bottom of the ocean. You're one of the only people who's ever been to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Can you explain what that looks like, what that feels like, how you felt?
Well, yeah, that there were two of us, Jacques Picard, the son of the inventor of the bathyscaphe Trieste, and myself. I was the Navy captain, if you will, the commanding officer of the Trieste. And we worked very hard. There were only two of these things in the world at the time we were doing this diving in 1959, 1960. So everything we did was new, pioneering, seeing and doing things for the first time. Since that time, as you correctly point out, it was about 52 years later before anybody went back. And that was Jim Cameron on his submersible he designed, and I was on that expedition. And then 7 years after Jim, American Victor Vescovo took his sub down to Challenger Deep. And I'm a little paternal pride here because my son Kelly was able to do the same dive I did with Victor, but many years later. It's pretty featureless down that deep in the ocean, and there's no fish down that deep. You've got a lot of invertebrates like shrimps, jellyfish, things like that. But other than that, it's it's a pretty unremarkable area. Subsequent dives, I mean, there have been now over, I think, 18 dives to Challenger Deep as of this date. And the later explorers had much better gear, much better kit, and have done some really terrific work in hadal biology. You call these the hadal depths, as in Hades, because it's the very deepest parts of the ocean. About 7
Um, Don, I was wondering whether I could just finally ask you a little bit more about Hamish Harding, who you said you had lunch with recently. I was reading a little bit about him. He's got a couple of Guinness World Records to his name, I think I'm right in saying. Can you tell us a bit more about Hamish Harding?
Well, he also made a dive to Challenger Deep with Victor Vescovo, and I think that he dove there just after my son dove there. There was a series of dives, and I believe that Hamish was on that. I was not there. I was not present, but I don't know what records he might have. I think it's to do with aviation, as I recall. I'd never met him before. I knew of him, and then, as I say, we had a lunch together last January.